Okay, on to Byzantium. The dividing line between late antiquity and the Byzantine Empire is not actually as clear as the chapter divisions make it seem. Constantine established the new Roman capital at Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople after himself. Theodosius, while he also ruled over a still undivided Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople and, as you may recall, imposed Christianity on an empire that was still probably predominantly pagan. All historians would call Justinian a Byzantine emperor, yet he was also the last Roman emperor to speak Latin as his first language, and he drove his empire close to bankruptcy with military campaigns aimed at winning back Western territory, North Africa from the Vandals, and Italy from the Ostrogoths. In the east, which was supposedly the Byzantine domain, Justinian basically bought off the Persians, who signed a treaty of eternal peace in return for a huge payment in gold. The Persians did not, however, stay bought, which is another reason why Justinian's reign ended up pretty much bankrupting his empire. Now, Byzantine rulers were a mixed lot, as we will see, but all ruled as head of both the government and the church. The struggles between popes and kings that would define much of Western European medieval history had no real parallel in the Byzantine Empire. The patriarch was an important personage, as were bishops, but when emperors said jump, they pretty much asked, how high? We'll see that relationship captured in mosaics in just a few minutes. But first, let's take up Justinian's story right after the Nika riots. On to Hagia Sophia. For almost 1,000 years, this was the largest church in the world, right up until 1520, when the cathedral in Sevilla, Spain, was completed. The minarets you see were, of course, a later addition after the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, though I think they integrated amazingly well with the original building, partly, of course, because Hagia Sophia became the model for so many mosques, and you probably have a better understanding of the mosque at Edirne now that you're looking at Hagia Sophia. As you watch the video, you probably noticed Arabic symbols that the Turks have placed inside the building. Hagia Sophia was a mosque from the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 until Ataturk secularized it and turned it into a museum in the 1930s. There is now a serious movement among Muslim Turks to make it a mosque once again. That's a news story you might want to follow. The aerial view gives you a clearer idea of the basic structure that you just saw explained. Note the central dome surrounded by the smaller domes. Buttresses, those are those walls that jut out from the aisles, help support the weight of the dome. We'll see much more dramatic buttresses when we get to Gothic art, Gothic cathedrals next month. This is a central plan church with a central dome supported by half domes and more or less equal sides, but it's a central dome plan imposed on a basilica plan. Again, you see the pillared triangular-shaped pendentives that hold up the dome while preserving those huge open spaces. This is what is so innovative about Hagia Sophia. And let me just note, it's really important that you learn how to read a floor plan. They show up pretty much on every AP exam, and besides, it's a useful life skill. So, what do those circles and half circles indicate? Domes. How about the heavy black spaces? Those are the columns holding the domes, the pendentives. And the X's usually indicate a vaulted ceiling above. We're going to talk more about reading floor plans as we look at more churches. Here's a drawing of pendentives with the curved triangles that unite the pillars to the drum and then to the dome. An alternative dome base employs squinches, which make a more direct transition from the cube to the cone and then a sphere. You need to know these terms, especially the pendentive. This is another somewhat clearer diagram of the same two structural features. Again, the main purposes of these architectural innovations were, first, to spread the weight of the dome and enable it to cover vast open spaces, and second, to marry the dome structure to a square or rectangular central plan model. The Pantheon meets the Basilica, and the two become one. You've seen a much simpler floor plan. So what does this floor plan include that the first one didn't? Well, you have both in your notes. This one includes some of the mosque features that remain in the structure, including the mihrab and maksara. Remember what those were? What were their functions? The mihrab was the niche that directed prayers toward Mecca. The maksura was the special enclosure for rulers, something the Byzantine and Ottoman rulers of Constantinople/Istanbul had in common was no separation of church or mosque and state. But these later additions notwithstanding, you should still find the inner and outer narthex or entryway, the nave, or as it's called in Greek Orthodox churches, naos, N-A-O-S, is the huge open area in the center. And what would be labeled as aisles in a basilica plan are called what here? They're called galleries. The apse would have housed the altar. There's no altar there now, of course. And note that it is not in the center under the dome. Note also that there's a baptistry off to the side. So we see elements of the basilican floor plan as well. These architectural details do not capture the feature of Hagia Sophia that, together with sheer size, is most amazing, and that is its light. Do you remember how light came into the Pantheon, which was the early domed building on which this was partly based? It entered through the oculus, or open hole in the roof. The pendentives are an innovation that make it possible to punctuate the domes with clerestory windows. And this means that light streams through to bounce off those acres of gold mosaic. The effect, very deliberately, is otherworldly. Skies aren't blue, they're gold. Byzantine churches are deliberately designed to invoke heaven on earth. They represent a very conscious attempt to take worshipers' minds off earthly realities, off the natural world, and encourage them to focus on the eternal and the unchanging. In this way, Byzantine art resembles art of what other cultures have you studied? What about Egypt? What about Buddhist art? Greek and Roman influences have not entirely disappeared, as we'll see, but they have been transformed. Your book quotes the most famous historian of Justinian's reign. He actually served as an aide to Justinian's top general, Belisarius. Procopius, that's the name of the historian, you don't actually need to know that name, described the 40 windows at the base of the dome as, quote, a golden chain from heaven. You might say the space is not illuminated by the sun from the outside, but the radiance is generated within. That effect is quite deliberate. Your book also quotes the philosopher Pseudo-Dionysius. Light comes from God, and light is the visual image of God. Byzantine art always has theological content. Note, too, the weightlessness of the figures. This is a way in which Byzantine art contrasts with Egyptian art, despite their mutual preoccupation with the eternal and unchanging. So here you see some more images of the interior and its extraordinary light. Note the delicate columns of the arcade. These are not structural features. They're decorative. Muslim artists were very influenced by Hagia Sophia, by the way. They deeply admired Byzantine craftsmen and hired as many as they could lure into the caliph's services. So, if these arch-topped pillars look familiar, they should. The Orthodox version of the Mass was, and still is, a highly solemn spectacle with a strong theatrical element. And please understand, I do not say that disrespectfully in any way. The church used music, still uses music, elaborate clerical dress, light, and incense to create an overwhelming sense of the majesty of God. It is not accident that the defining image of Byzantine art is not Christ as the Good Shepherd, but Christ Pantocrator, ruler and judge of all, the emperor, as the emperor is ruler and judge of all. We're going to get to those images soon. Indeed, the huge central naos, or nave, really did function as a kind of stage. Only the clergy and the emperor were allowed in this space. The congregation was relegated to the darker aisles or galleries, unable to come fully into the light as they would come into heaven only upon death. These are the kind of details that would really strengthen an essay on Byzantine sacred space, because it would connect artistic detail to religious and cultural detail. So I hope you've been taking notes. You saw an excellent podcast on San Vitale, and it's well worth rewatching it before you take the test. San Vitale is a huge favorite with the College Board. In fact, I would recommend revisiting this one in May. So we saw Ravenna churches in the last chapter. The Ostrogoths under Theodora captured Ravenna and made it the Ostrogothic capital. Justinian captured it back, and he celebrated that victory with this spectacular church. For the most part, as we learned in the earlier unit, or the earlier portion of this unit, churches in the West used the longitudinal basilica plan, the rectangular plan, rather than the central plan. But as you see here, San Vitale was an exception. I would have blown up this floor plan, but again, I would have had to move too many labels. The basic structure, as you can see, is an octagon within an octagon, although inside the curved lines of the dome and half domes really obscure this. You see the rather strange and completely atypical narthex. This long, narrow space architecturally feels rather separate from the rest of the church, although the apses at either end do tie it to the inner domes of the church. Smaller half domes create a pillared ambulatory around the central dome area, with the sanctuary, which remember is open only to the emperor and the clergy, connecting it to the central dome area. The altar is placed in the apse. That's one concession of the basilican style. For some reason, the slide didn't draw an arrow to the exedrae, and I thought that labeling was unclear, so I have added one. The next slide, which is not in your book, gives you a clearer look at that architectural feature. So here you see those semicircular enclosures or exedrae. In an effort, believe it or not, to shorten your study guide, I took this word off the vocabulary list. I'm not sure that was a good call after all, so here it is again. The upper gallery of the ambulatory, by the way, was reserved for married women. But like most of the great religious buildings of Ravenna, San Vitale's most extraordinary feature is its mosaics. Here's the view of the choir in the apse. Note, the altar is in the apse, with the famous mosaic of Christ between two angels, Saint Vitalis, the Ravenna martyr after whom the church is named, and Bishop Ecclesius. Here's a closer look at that famous mosaic. So how is Christ portrayed in this mosaic? Well, he's youthful. As you will see, most later Byzantine portraits of Christ, including the images in the Hagia Sophia that will be made there after the iconoclasts destroyed the originals, you're going to learn about that in your next lecture, show Christ as older, bearded, powerful. This, however, is the youthful, exuberant Christ of earlier Christian art. He's sitting on an orb, so this is still Christ Pancrator, or the ruler of the world. He's flanked by two angels, and we see Christ handing a crown of martyrdom to San Vitale, while Bishop Ecclesius is presenting Christ with the model of the church. That, by the way, is a very common image in Byzantine art, something you see in Hagia Sophia as well. So, any more observations you can make about the world that is depicted in this mosaic? Well, it is not naturalistic. I've never seen a gold sky myself. The design is hieratic. Remember, that means it's highly stylized and bound by artistic conventions and iconography that artists are more or less forced by their patrons to follow. Another convention, again, is a kind of weightlessness and denial of bodily reality. There don't seem to be bodies underneath these draperies. We don't see any knees poking out or hips swelling under the cloth. The figures are rigidly frontal and all stand on the same plane. There is no effort to establish perspective, although I'd note that the dome itself, the shape of the dome, gives some dynamism and sense of movement to this mosaic. Many of the designs are geometrical. The tesserae lend brilliant color and they reflect light. In other words, this is a quintessentially Byzantine, but an early Byzantine work, early especially because of the portrayal of Christ. I mention this, by the way, because the College Board will frequently ask you to discuss features that make a work identifiably Byzantine. And you might even get a work of Byzantine art that you haven't seen, but which you should be able to clearly define as identify as Byzantine. Well, I've warned you I love mosaics, right? And this church, like the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, is one of my favorite places in Italy. On the list, please. So let me quickly show you just a few more mosaics from San Vitale before we get to the famous and beloved of the College Board mosaics of Justinian and Theodora. Here you see the south wall, and you get a sense of how every inch of wall space is covered with brilliant art. Here we see three angels visiting Abraham and Sarah to foretell the birth of Christ. You remember the term for this kind of Old Testament art in a Christian church? It's prefiguration. This is seen by Christians as prefiguring the miraculous birth of Jesus. That's another vocabulary word that the College Board loves. Here are some more details from the panel. While the figures are stylized and flat, Abraham and Sarah at least show some expression, and we also see some depiction of the natural world, including a blue sky. But Byzantine art is hieratic or highly stylized, bound by convention. Still, this is not unemotional, and this will be clearer when we look at icons in the next lecture. So we have hieratic and stylized, but not necessarily unemotional art. Oops. And here again are events in the life of Moses. Note again the highly stylized depiction of nature. Those are very uniform burning bushes, and the rocks of Mount Sinai, at least to me, look more like staircases. On the other hand, the natural features do give some sense of volume and perspective to the mosaic. It's less flat than some we've seen and some we will see. Okay, on to the famous mosaics of Justinian and Theodora. Here you see Justinian holding the paten, that's P-A-T-E-N, or the bowl for communion bread. By the way, Justinian never visited this church. So why is he shown so prominently? Well, why put statues of Augustus everywhere? To remind people of who's boss. And what groups are represented in this famous imperial portrait? Well, we see the emperor and his staff. We see the clergy. And note that the bishop warrants a label, whereas the purple-robed Justinian needs no label. The third group we see is the army, portrayed much more uniformly, probably deliberately to indicate a unity of the army. I'm hoping you have time to pause now and work together on a compare and contrast worksheet, looking at this work together with the procession in Augustus's famous Ara Pacis, looking for similarities and for differences. Well, whether you've had time to pause to do the worksheet or not, here are my thoughts. First, on this work, there is no perspective here. All the figures are floating over a ground line. There is some overlapping, but otherwise relatively little sense of volume. The way the feet are pointed suggests the procession's forward movement, but otherwise the work is very static. The drapery is more geometrical than flowing, and we have no real indication of body shape. But what's really significant here, and something that frankly it has in common with the Ara Pacis, is that this mosaic captures the union of religious, political, and military power that characterized the Byzantine Empire. So, again to compare, here's the procession of Augustus's family from the Ara Pacis. The theme is much the same, right? So is the purpose, reinforcing power and authority. But what differences do you see? Well, there are real bodies here. The faces are not all frontal. We see bent knees, thighs, and shoulders poking through the costumes. And certainly Justinian's highly formal family pose has no place for children tugging at a cloak, although note that both portray a unity between an emperor and an empress, which is actually rather unusual. So here's a close-up of Justinian's face. Note the long, thin nose that's characteristic of Byzantine portraits. Notice, too, the emperor's 5 o'clock shadow. Apparently, the slightly scruffy, unshaven look was considered masculine and sexy back then, too. When you see the placement of this mosaic in the apse, does it change your perception of Justinian's vision of himself? What does it say? Well, he's mighty important, right above the altar and all that. But Christ and even the martyred saint really get pride of place in this church. It would be a mistake to see Byzantine Christianity as merely a tame instrument of political power. Yes, church and state were united. Yes, the emperor was in charge of the church. But Justinian was by all accounts a devout Christian, and while he took himself very seriously, he did not, you note, place himself above his savior. Theodora. My older daughter, Harriet, loves tough broads in history. Hatshepsut, Boadicea, Queen Elizabeth, but Theodora has always been her favorite. Theodora was a circus performer, almost certainly a prostitute, and Justinian defied social custom and potentially endangered, the legitimacy of his rule by marrying her rather than just keeping her as his mistress. And she, in turn, became his most valued political advisor, and as we saw, saved his skin and his regime when she talked him out of fleeing the Nika revolt. I have to say, I think more highly of Justinian that instead of resenting Theodora's power and influence, he allowed, presumably encouraged, her to be memorialized in this panel. So what parallels do you see to the portrait of Justinian, and what differences? Well, both are holding communion elements, and by all accounts, Theodora too was devout. Both are richly dressed in royal purple, and that's a symbol for that only the emperor and empress could use. But there are some important differences as well. Theodora has a retinue or group of followers as well, but her attendants represent neither spiritual nor military power. Also, you can't really tell this from the slide, this mosaic lies outside the sanctuary in a courtyard. She enters in the procession after her husband and does not occupy as exalted a place. And by the way, she could not sit with him in church. In Byzantine churches, as in synagogues and mosques, men and women were separate. Still, she's done pretty well by herself. Here's just a close-up of the same portrait. And here's still another Ravenna church with a famous apse mosaic. Note again that this interior is much more magnificent than the exterior. There is the hand of God, which appears in a number of churches. We'll see another one in a minute. I couldn't find an entirely satisfactory blow-up of the mosaic, but this gives you a somewhat better view. You see the gold sky, the lack of perspective, the figures that are weightless and floating in space, as befits their otherworldly status. But you also see the younger Christ, the Good Shepherd. This is an indication it's an early Byzantine, earlier Christian work. By the way, vocabulary. What term describes the way Sant'Apollinare is portrayed? He is portrayed, I'm sorry, this is Sant'Apollinare and not the Good Shepherd? Oh, my mistake. Any rate, he is portrayed as an orant. Here's a closer look at the hand of God in the Sant'Apollinare mosaic and one from San Vitale, which is not quite as overwhelmingly gold and very beautiful. So now we're looking at two Ravenna mosaics, roughly 100 years apart. So what changes have taken place in Byzantine mosaic portraiture? Again, you have an opportunity to do a worksheet. And if you don't have time for that, or if you've already paused, I'll go on and talk about this. Gallo Placidia dates from around 450. And the similarities of theme should be fairly obvious. Note that this is a favorite early Christian motif. But in the earlier Christian motif mosaic, the sheep have a place in the landscape, albeit a stylized place. The trees actually appear to be growing out of the ground. Christ is not rigidly frontal, seems to have a body. There is overlapping and a general sense of three-dimensionality and volume. So we've been looking at parish churches, but another very important development in this period was the explosive growth of the monastic movement. It began in Egypt and spread rapidly through the Eastern Empire. At first, those seeking a more spiritual life moved into the wilderness alone, but not long afterward, monks began assembling in communities. This monastery is found at Mount Sinai in Egypt. Note the typical wall separating the monastery from the world. The refectory was a dining hall, a major gathering place. We're going to encounter that term again since refectories were often richly decorated. So what would you guess was the most common biblical scene in a refectory? The Last Supper. So Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper was painted in a refectory, which is one reason why you need to know that term. This mosaic is found in the monastery church in the apse. So what's happening here? Bible history for 100. Well, appropriately enough, for Mount Sinai, we see Moses and Elijah witnessing Jesus' transfiguration. The disciples, John, Peter, and James, appear prostrate at his feet. By the way, you have seen a mandorla before in Buddhist art. Note that it is not simply a large halo, but a different artistic device that can be used together with a halo to depict holiness. So how does the artist contrast Jesus, Moses, and Elijah with the disciples? Well, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are calm and serene. One thinks of Egyptian statues, while the disciples are distraught. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are rigidly frontal. The apostles, still caught in the terrors and temptation of earth, show movement. What landscape elements do you see? That was a trick question. There aren't any. Once again, the sky is heavenly gold, not earthly blue. Note too that the bodies cast no shadows. They are spiritual. This is art beyond time and space. I'll close today's lecture with two ivories. The Barberini ivory shows an emperor, probably Justinian, entering a city triumphantly. So what classical elements do you see? And by the way, that's another famous College Board question. Well, there's the twisting dynamic horse, the overlapping. The bottom frieze depicts defeated enemies and subjects bringing tribute. Victory is personified. See the winged woman bringing the crown. We also see exotic elements, a lion, an elephant. And what Christian elements do you see? Well, a youthful Christ is blessing Justinian's victory. So you've got another compare and contrast opportunity. My guess is you don't have time for this, but you have the worksheet there. Look at how it compares with the High Roman Empire bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius on a horse. So what's really striking here is, again, the mixture of classical and Byzantine elements. So what's classical? What's Byzantine? The drapery is covering a real body. You can see the shape of the legs. On the other hand, we don't really see the contrapposto or a shift of weight to maintain balance. The fluid drapery, the facial type, and the hairstyle all evoke the classical era. Yet the angel is too large for the architectural background, so we see hierarchy of scale. Michael's feet are odd and unrealistic. He seems to be standing on 3 steps at the same time. The orb is a Christian symbol for God's rule over the entire world. In other words, the artist does not feel compelled to depict the 3-dimensional world realistically because the work of art isn't really about this world. So here's a summary slide of the main features of Byzantine art. I borrowed this from another teacher, but I think it's a good summary, and you have an opportunity now to take notes.